Most people don't go to church anymore. They don't pray. They don't read scripture. And yet, touch Christmas, and they become fiercely protective. Suddenly, it's sacred. Suddenly, it matters. But here's the strange part. It's not belief they're defending, it's a feeling. Because religion isn't surviving on faith anymore. It's surviving on Christmas. And once you see how that works, you can't unsee it. The strangest contradiction. Here's a contradiction no one talks about, mostly because it feels too uncomfortable to name out loud. Ask people what they believe, and the answers come slowly. They pause, they hedge, they soften the truth. You hear phrases like, "I'm not really religious," or "I'm spiritual in my own way," or "I don't think about it much anymore." Belief has become optional, negotiable, even a little embarrassing. But question Christmas and something shifts instantly. The air tightens, voices sharpen. People who seemed indifferent seconds ago suddenly lean forward. They defend, they explain, they correct you, not with calm reasoning, but with emotion, as if something precious is being touched without permission. And that's the strange part. Because if belief is fading, why does this one ritual still provoke such intensity? Why protect a religion you don't practice? Why guard traditions tied to doctrines you no longer accept? The answer hides in what actually gets triggered. It is not theology. It is not scripture. It is not even God. It is memory. When Christmas is questioned, people are not defending an idea. They are defending a version of themselves. A time when the world felt safer, smaller, softer around the edges. A living room filled with light. Familiar voices. Predictable warmth in a year that otherwise felt uncertain. Those memories are not abstract. They are physical. Smells, sounds, textures. They live deeper in the mind than arguments ever could. And when something lives that deep, logic does not reach it. This is why debates about Christmas rarely stay rational. You are not arguing with beliefs that were reasoned into place. You are touching emotional anchors that were formed long before skepticism existed. Memory does not ask if something is true. It asks if something feels familiar, and familiarity feels like truth. So, when someone questions Christmas, it feels like more than critique. It feels like erosion, like something solid is being quietly removed beneath their feet. Not faith exactly, but stability, continuity, a sense that some things remain untouched by time. This is why people who never pray will still insist Christmas matters. Why they will say it is about family, tradition, values, anything except belief, while still defending it with the intensity of faith. Because memory does not weaken when belief fades. It hardens, and once belief dies, memory becomes its replacement. Nostalgia as evidence. Think back, not carefully, but honestly. Let the memory come the way it actually does, unstructured and unfiltered. The lights were softer than usual. The room felt different, almost suspended from ordinary time. There were smells that only appeared once a year, foods that did not exist outside that season. Music played in the background, not demanding attention, just filling the silence with something familiar and safe. You were not analyzing any of it. You were not asking where the story came from or whether it made sense. You were not weighing evidence or questioning origins. You were absorbing emotion the way children always do. Quietly, completely. Safety came first, not safety as an idea, but as a bodily sensation. Warmth in the room, adults who seemed calmer than usual, a sense that nothing bad was allowed to happen here, at least not tonight. Togetherness followed naturally. People gathered not to debate meaning, but to share space, to repeat gestures, to play roles everyone already knew. That feeling did not argue for God. It did not need to. It felt like proof without ever claiming to be proof. When something feels that stable, that reliable, the mind does not separate the experience from the story attached to it. The emotion becomes evidence, even if no one ever says that out loud. Years later, when belief weakens, that emotional evidence remains untouched. You may forget sermons, you may reject doctrine, but you do not forget how it felt to be small and protected while the world outside went dark and cold. That memory becomes a quiet reference point. Not consciously, but persistently. And this is where logic loses its footing. Once an emotion attaches itself to an idea early enough, the idea no longer stands alone. It is fused to comfort, identity, and belonging. Questioning it no longer feels like inquiry. It feels like threat. Not because the belief is strong, but because the emotion is. Decades later, the mind may know better. It may recognize contradictions. It may admit doubts, but the body remembers first, and the body does not care about arguments. It cares about what once made it feel whole. That is why nostalgia becomes evidence. Not because it proves anything, but because it bypasses the need for proof altogether. Childhood imprinting never expires. Children do not question meaning the way adults do. They do not stand outside an experience and analyze it. They move through it. They absorb it. Meaning enters quietly, through repetition, tone, and atmosphere, rather than explanation. What is present during moments of joy becomes associated with safety. What repeats during moments of calm becomes trusted. That is how rituals take root. When joy and security arrive wrapped in ritual, the ritual does not feel optional. It feels necessary. It becomes part of how the world works. Not because anyone said so, but because it was there every time comfort appeared. Lights, songs, familiar words. Predictable gestures that returned year after year, always signaling the same emotional outcome. Children do not ask why this works. They learn that it does. Years pass. Belief becomes complicated. Questions arise. Education introduces doubt. Life introduces contradiction. Skepticism grows naturally, the way it always does when certainty collides with reality. But the imprint stays. That imprint is not a belief. It is a pathway. A shortcut the mind learned early on between ritual and relief. Long before religion became a claim to evaluate, it was already a feeling to return to. And pathways learned early do not disappear just because the explanation attached to them falls apart. This is why Christmas does not argue for religion. It does not defend doctrine or demand agreement. It bypasses the argument entirely. It does not say, believe this. It says, remember this. You were happy once. You felt safe once. You belonged somewhere once. Do not lose that. That whisper does not need words. It arrives through repetition, through the same songs played again, through decorations taken out of storage, through phrases repeated without reflection. The body recognizes the pattern before the mind has time to object. And once the body recognizes it, resistance feels unnatural. Questioning feels disruptive. Even people who reject religion intellectually find themselves participating anyway, telling themselves it is harmless, cultural, just tradition. But tradition is never just neutral. It carries emotional weight forward, untouched by time. That is why childhood imprinting never expires. It does not require belief to function. It only requires memory. And memory, once paired with safety and joy, becomes one of the strongest forces in human psychology. Quiet, persistent, nearly impossible to undo. Why faith spikes in December. Notice something odd, something that quietly contradicts what we are usually told about belief. Faith does not surge during wars. It does not peak during pandemics. It does not suddenly strengthen when people stare into uncertainty or confront mortality head-on. In those moments, belief often fractures or goes silent. But in December, something different happens. Churches fill a little more. Religious language re-enters conversations. Even people who claim no belief begin to speak with reverence again. Not urgency, not desperation, comfort. Why December? Because fear does not revive religion. Routine does. Crisis makes people question. Routine makes people comply. Religion struggles in chaos because chaos disrupts structure. But Christmas is structure perfected. It arrives the same way every year. Same calendar, same cues, same emotional arc. The mind does not have to decide anything. It simply follows a script it already knows. Annual repetition matters more than belief. When something happens at the same time, in the same way, with the same emotional payoff, it stops feeling optional. It becomes expected. And expectation is one of the strongest psychological forces we have. Predictable emotion is even more powerful. December promises warmth regardless of what the year was like. It offers closure, soft lighting after long darkness, familiar music after months of noise. A sense that something is being completed, even if nothing is resolved. Then comes shared performance. People dress the same way, decorate the same spaces, repeat the same phrases, participate in synchronized emotion, not because they believe the same things, but because they are doing them together. Shared behavior creates the illusion of shared belief. This is why religion does not need conviction once a year. It needs rehearsal, a reminder of how it feels to participate without questioning, a moment when belief is not examined but enacted. Christmas provides that moment perfectly. It does not ask people to commit, it asks them to show up, to repeat, to feel. And once the performance begins, belief becomes secondary. The ritual carries itself forward, year after year, reinforced by familiarity rather than truth. That is why faith spikes in December, not because people suddenly believe more, but because they remember how to play the part. And the stage is already set. Ritual over reason. Ritual works even when belief doesn't. That is the part most people miss. You do not need to believe in Santa to enjoy the tree. You do not need theology to hum along to familiar songs. Participation does not require conviction. It only requires presence. That is the secret. Ritual operates on a different layer of the mind than reason. Reason asks questions. Ritual answers them before they are fully formed. It tells you when to gather, what to repeat, how to feel, and when to stop thinking about it. By the time logic tries to intervene, the experience is already underway. Religion survives this way not by being true, but by being repeated. Repetition creates familiarity. Familiarity creates comfort, and comfort creates loyalty that feels deeper than belief. Say something often enough, and it begins to feel normal. Celebrate it long enough, and it starts to feel necessary. Wrap it in warmth and nostalgia, and it becomes protected. Not because it cannot be questioned, but because questioning it carries a cost. That cost is emotional. When a ritual has been repeated through moments of happiness, togetherness, and relief, it becomes associated with those states. Removing the belief does not remove the association. The mind does not say this idea is false. It says, this feels like home. And once something feels like home, challenging, it feels like vandalism. This is why people who reject religious claims still defend religious holidays. They may not accept the story, but they still crave the structure, the rhythm, the permission to slow down and belong somewhere without explanation. Ritual offers certainty without argument. It does not demand agreement. It invites repetition, and repetition is easier than reflection. Over time, the line between belief and behavior blurs. People stop asking why they do something and start insisting it must be done, not because it makes sense, but because it feels wrong not to. That is how questioning begins to feel like loss. Loss of comfort, loss of identity, loss of something that once anchored the year. Ritual does not convince the mind, it conditions it, quietly, patiently, year after year. And once conditioning is complete, reason no longer has the final word. Why people feel attacked. When someone questions Christmas, the reaction is rarely thoughtful or analytical. It does not arrive as a counter-argument or a calm explanation. It arrives as tension, as irritation, as a sudden need to shut the conversation down. That alone should tell us something. Because if this were only about ideas, the response would be intellectual, but it isn't. The reaction is emotional because the threat is not perceived as philosophical. It does not feel like an attack on religion or doctrine. It feels personal, intimate, as if something private is being exposed without consent. Questioning Christmas feels like questioning childhood itself. Parents come to mind first, not as complex adults with flaws and contradictions, but as protectors, providers, the people who made the ritual possible, the ones who tried, in their own imperfect way, to create moments of safety and wonder. To question the ritual feels, on some level, like questioning their love. Then come the moments that felt safe, nights when the world outside seemed distant, when problems paused, when time slowed down. Those moments were rare, and because they were rare, they became precious. People do not defend Christmas because they believe every part of its story. They defend it because it is linked to the few times life felt simple, before responsibility expanded, before loss accumulated, before uncertainty became constant. So, when someone challenges Christmas, it does not feel like curiosity. It feels like erasure, like someone is trying to take away a shelter that no longer exists but is still needed emotionally. This is why anger appears so quickly. Anger is often a cover for grief, and what is being grieved here is not God. It is the fading of a feeling that once made the world coherent. People do not fear losing God. That loss already happened quietly for many of them. What they fear is losing access to the emotional memory that replaced belief after belief fell apart. Christmas is not just a holiday. It is a reminder that once, even briefly, the world made sense, that there was order, warmth, meaning without explanation. And when someone questions that, the mind reacts the only way it knows how. It defends the feeling, religion's last perfect loop. Most religious rituals were built for a different psychological world, a world where authority went unquestioned, where belief came first and behavior followed naturally. You were expected to accept the story, then obey the structure built around it. As that world faded, so did those rituals. They struggled to adapt because they asked too much too early. They demanded belief first, compliance second. In a skeptical age, that order collapses. People hesitate. They doubt. They opt out before the ritual ever begins. Christmas did something different. It reversed the sequence. Celebrate first. Participate without commitment. Feel something before you are asked to explain anything. Belief can come later, or not at all. That reversal changed everything. Christmas does not open with a demand. It opens with invitation. Lights appear, music plays, familiar gestures return. None of it asks what you believe. It only asks if you want to join. And most people do, because the cost of joining is low and the emotional reward is immediate. Once participation begins, belief becomes irrelevant. The ritual carries itself. People decorate, gather, repeat phrases, exchange gifts, perform kindness. All of it feels meaningful, even without theological agreement. That is the loop. Participation creates emotion. Emotion creates attachment. Attachment discourages questioning, and the cycle resets the following year without needing reinforcement. Other rituals failed because they argued their case. They tried to convince Christmas never bothers. It understands something older and deeper about human psychology. People do not commit because something is true. They commit because something feels good to return to. This is why Christmas survives when other religious practices fade into obligation or nostalgia. It does not feel like duty. It feels like permission. Permission to pause, to gather, to feel connected without having to justify why. As belief systems erode, most rituals lose their footing. Christmas does not. It floats above belief, anchored instead to emotion, memory, and repetition. That is why it still works when everything else is fading. It is not asking people to believe, it is asking them to remember. And memory is far more resilient than faith. The quiet realization. Once you see it, everything shifts, not loudly, not all at once, quietly. The way real understanding usually arrives. The patterns that once felt separate suddenly align. Behavior comes before belief. Emotion arrives before explanation. And what looked like faith reveals itself as something far older and more subtle. People do not believe because they celebrate. They celebrate, and belief sneaks in afterward. Not as doctrine, not as conviction, but as atmosphere, as familiarity, as a background assumption that never asks to be examined. The ritual happens first, and meaning is added later, almost as an afterthought. Over time, the meaning feels earned, simply because it has been there so long. This is why arguments against belief often miss their target. They aim at ideas while the mechanism operates somewhere else entirely. Belief here is not a conclusion, it is a residue. Something left behind after years of repetition and emotion. What settles in is not a statement like God exists, but a quieter impression. This feels important. This feels right. This feels like it should not be questioned. That impression does not present itself as belief. It presents itself as respect, as tradition, as something that deserves protection simply because it has always been there. The mind tells itself it is not religious, while the emotional structure of religion continues operating beneath the surface. Nostalgia does the work belief used to do. It creates continuity between past and present. It makes earlier feelings feel relevant now. It allows people to say this matters without having to say why. And because nostalgia is rooted in personal memory, it resists external challenge. You cannot disprove how something felt. You can debate ideas, you can critique stories, you can dismantle arguments, but you cannot argue someone out of a memory that once made them feel whole. That is the quiet realization. Religion does not survive because its claims withstand scrutiny. It survives because certain rituals continue to generate feelings that feel too meaningful to abandon. Christmas is the most successful example of this. Not because it convinces, but because it endures. Once you understand that, belief stops looking like the cause. It looks like the after effect. And nostalgia, once installed, is nearly impossible to remove. Christmas isn't fake. It's older than Christianity. It doesn't belong to a religion. It belongs to humans, to our fear of darkness, to our need for warmth, to our instinct to gather when the world feels uncertain and cold. Understanding this doesn't take Christmas away. It gives it back. It frees the ritual from dogma and returns it to something honest and deeply human. A shared response to winter, to loneliness, to the quiet anxiety that arrives when days grow short. That may be why it still works, even as belief fades. Not because people are convinced, but because they remember. Because light in the darkness still matters, regardless of the story attached to it. If this made you see tradition differently, if understanding made the ritual richer rather than weaker, stay curious. Subscribe if you value truth without losing meaning. And whatever you celebrate this season, remember why humans have always lit lights in the dark.